I'm John Keener, Mayor of Pacifica, and I'd like to welcome you to this planning meeting of the Sea Level Rise Group. And first, let me recognize a couple other council members. Sue Ross is here. There she is in the back. Michael Neal is behind her. We have the planning director, Tina Wehrmeister, is here. And somewhere, Deirdre Martin, right there. And in the back, Kevin Woodhouse, city manager. And everybody else, I think, I'll let introduce them. So tonight's meeting is a discussion of the economic analysis of properties that are in potential harm's way. And I know at least some of us have been waiting a couple months for this, and we're eager to hear what our speaker has to say. So let's let him get to it. And thank you for coming.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Gettleman. I work for Current and West. I'm going to be the facilitator for the workshop today, so just keeping the conversation on track and on time. Make sure that you all get out of here on time as well. We're going to start with some introductions, just to the staff of the city and also the consultant staff that are working on this project. So we've already met Tina, but maybe Tina, you could just hand it over to James and just go around for the folks that are working on this project so you know who they are.
I'm James Jackson with ESA.
Good afternoon, Bob Natalia with ESA. I'm Phil King. I'm an economics professor at San Francisco State. I'm working for ESA on how we talk about it tonight.
I'm Marvin with Curtin West.
Bonnie O'Connor, Assistant Planner with the City of Pacifica.
Thomas Myers, Economic Development Manager, City of Pacifica.
Kevin Woodhouse, City Manager.
Okay, thank you. Other introductions, just want to recognize we have a number of community worker members who are in the room today. Just have you guys raise your hand. Great. Good turnout. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to walk through our meeting objectives. How many people have been to a sea level rise? This is the third one. How many have been to either one, first or second? Great. Keep coming back. So the format of this one is going to be similar to the most recent one we had. It was on April 26th. It's a similar format. We're going to start with an overview of the planning process, and that includes what work's been completed to date, where we are now, and where we're heading in the process. So just want to get sort of grounded of where we are. We do want to provide a summary of the input that's been provided in these public meetings, just to have a sense for what we're hearing and how we're using that information moving forward. And then really the focus of today, to Mayor Keener's point, is on the economic analysis of sea level rise hazards. We really want to make sure that you understand how this is being done, what the methodology is, and how this relates to the overall planning process, so how it fits in to the sea level rise planning process. And then we really want to provide time for you to ask questions and to provide comments. So there will be some time for presentation. Most of the time today is actually for you all to ask questions and provide information to us. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through the agenda. We'll start with the presentation right after I'm done here. We'll start with just an update on the overall process as I mentioned before, the summary of input provided to date, and then Dr. Phil King is going to walk us through the economic analysis methodology. So that's going to include, again, what is the role, what data is being used, how are they being used, and how does this relate to understanding the sort of cost benefit as it relates to the economics, and then Q&A. So just some ground rules. These should look familiar, recognizing there are lots of different views in the room. We just ask you to be respectful about any differences that are in the room. Please help me keep things on time, honor the agenda, and really focus on what we're focusing on today. And if you have a cell phone in the room, which you probably do, please turn it off or turn it on silent. Okay, great. All right, so the way that we'll do the public participation is, my request to you all is that let us get through the presentation, because it could be that your questions will be answered with the slide that comes right after it. So we're going to ask you to allow us to get through the presentation, and then we're going to have lots of time for questions and comments. If you have a question, we have these blue little sheets that are up at the table. Fill out this question card with your name and just raise your hand or give it to me or give it to Matt in the back, and we'll create a queue. So we just want to make sure we're fair and getting your questions answered. But if you have a question, fill out a card, hand it in, and once we get to the public comment and question part of the agenda, we're just going to go through the questions as we get them. If you just have a comment that you'd like to make, that is fine too. We're going to ask you to keep it at 2 minutes, just recognizing the number of people here, and I'll just give you the microphone and you can make your comment. So hopefully that's clear. We found it worked pretty well last time and helped us keep things organized. So another way to provide input is in written form. So there are comment forms up at the table where Matt is. You can write in your comment as well, and then the city will have that. So a couple different ways of providing input. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Tina for an update on the planning process.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to stand over in this corner so I can see the slides, and I'd like to acknowledge that we can actually see the slides better than last time. Again, my name is Tina Wermeister. I'm the planning director for the city of Pacifica. And since a good majority or a good amount of you were here previously or attended last meeting or the meeting before, I'm here. Can you put the mic on? Okay, very good. Up close and personal. I'm going to quickly go through the project background. Many of you have already heard this. So, the City of Pacifica's current local coastal plan was adopted in 1980, so it's very old. We do have a draft update that was prepared, but it does not include adaptation planning and sea level rise analysis, which is now required. So the city received a grant from the Coastal Commission and Coastal Conservancy to update the draft local coastal plan with an adaptation component. In the end of March, the City Council adopted goals for this plan, which informs the staff and the consultant working on the project, and those goals are to bolster the efficacy of public safety efforts, to respond to climate change, to preserve existing neighborhoods and promote economic justice and local economic vitality. And key to that is that that goal is to preserve existing homes, neighborhoods, businesses, and infrastructure. And then lastly, to preserve and enhance coastal access. So the update process will include engaging the community and stakeholders throughout the process. We will identify the policies and programs to facilitate the adaptation plan alternatives. We will then prepare the adaptation plan, get it out to the public for comment, and then bring back to our decision makers. Planning Commission will make a recommendation. Ultimately, the City Council will decide on the appropriate policies and approve the document. Then it is submitted to the Coastal Commission for review and approval. So a little bit more on the process. We heard from the community that they really wanted more information, to be more engaged in the process. So the City Council authorized additional engagement activities, including 2 additional public meetings. This is the second of those 2 additional meetings. Total, there's going to be 9 meetings that the community is encouraged to attend, and that does not include the public hearings, which are closed to public and you're all welcome to attend and provide input. Did a citywide mailer, and we're also, staff is also going out to special events and to try to get word out to the community about this project, to get people interested and engaged. So upcoming meetings, Thursday, May 31st is a community work group meeting, and that will be on the draft adaptation plan. And then Saturday, June 23rd is a public workshop meeting on the draft adaptation plan. We heard comments that folks may have trouble getting to the evening meetings, and so we did want to include the weekends. So if more people wanted to participate, they could. So we encourage you to follow the project online, sign up to get our newsletter, and be informed. And if you go to the City of Pacifica website, cityofpacifica.org, there's a button right on the front page so that you can get access to this section of the website. So here's just an overview of the adaptation planning process. So we've already identified the sea level rise scenario projections. We identified areas that are vulnerable and those potential impacts. And currently we're working on the adaptation plan and putting together draft policy measures. Here's just a little slide of the schedule where we are kind of in the middle of the project there. And we'll be working on policy recommendations through the summer and then public hearings in the fall. So again, here's the meeting goals. Tonight, we wanted to have a shared understanding of the economic analysis methodology. And then, as I mentioned, the next meetings will be communicating with the public on draft adaptation strategies. And this is just another way to summarize what I previously said. And we do want you all to know that we're listening and we're hearing you. We're working on responses to comments. We have received a large amount of comments, and so that's taken us some time to put together. But we do want you to know that we're hearing what the community has to say. So this is just a summary of some of the comments we received during the vulnerability assessment phase of the project. So on February 13th, plus via written communications, we heard about how people use the coast to where they live, where they recreate, where they shop, the values that are important to people in this community. So commerce, infrastructure, trails, beaches, their homes. And then from the last meeting, we did hear that it's really important to consider impacts on private properties, both residential and commercial private properties, and to consider the importance of homeowners being able to continue to maintain and protect their properties. We also heard that we need to think about identifying funding sources for adaptation, very important, and coordinating regionally and maybe beyond on some of these activities. So that's just a summary of where we've been and the process. And so I just wanted to give you all a little introduction to the economic analysis methodology before I turn it over to Dr. King. So this is just going to give you some idea about how this all will fit into the adaptation process. So we're currently in the stage of selecting the adaptation strategies to recommend, the draft strategies. So the way we do that is we identify and evaluate a range of alternatives that we introduced at the last meeting. Those are in 4 broad categories: protect, such as seawalls and sand replenishment, to accommodate, just raising structures, retreat, or a hybrid of all or some of those. And of course, we take into consideration public stakeholder input. And so then what we'll do is we'll evaluate the alternatives for alignment with community values. So that's where we get back to the goals that the City Council set for this project, and also the community input that we're hearing from you all. We'll look at technical feasibility. Will it work? Can it be done? Legal consistency with our general plan, the Coastal Act, our LCP, as well as property rights. Then we'll be looking at a cost-benefit analysis. And so part of that is economic, which you'll hear about that methodology tonight. But there's also other factors in a cost-benefit analysis that are hard to quantify, so environment and the social fabric of our community as well. So it's not only going to be economic, but there's going to be other factors that will be taken into account. So here's just another slide here. So we will estimate the value of vulnerable areas. We'll estimate the losses for each scenario that we're studying. We'll also input adaptation costs that we're getting from our engineering team. And then that results in economic data to inform the policy decisions. So as I mentioned, it's not the only component, but it's part of what we'll be using to evaluate adaptation options. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. King.
Thank you, Jan. Got too many things on hand. Can everybody hear me? I'm used to lecturing without a microphone, but I'll do a little microphone here. First of all, I want to say that nobody really likes benefit cost analyses, and everybody's suspicious of them. I know as an economist. I'm sure some of you are suspicious right now. But it's a tool that can be very useful for our community for a couple of reasons. First of all, it does give you an idea of what the value of these assets are. I'm going to talk about that as we go through this slide. But second of all, it also can help you get funding in the future if you do need to, if you have fairly expensive adaptation strategies, which I think you will, given past armoring costs, et cetera, you need to have some kind of economic methodology which justifies that the benefits exceed the cost. And there are standard metrics that are used. So if you go to the Corps of Engineers or if you go to the state of California, they're going to want to see this. And the methods that I'm using in this study are consistent with both state and federal guidelines. So I don't get to do whatever I want here. I pretty much follow the guidelines. Now, I've been involved in setting some of the state guidelines, but I don't have a lot of wiggle room. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. The second point I want to make is ultimately this is a community decision. And so we may very well come out with one option that has a higher net benefits or benefit cost ratio, but you as a community may decide to choose another alternative. So nothing that I am doing or that's in this analysis forces the city of Pacifica to follow one policy or another policy. On the other hand, if you're asking for funding from the state and the federal government, it might make a difference. The other thing I should say is what we're doing here again is more what the Corps of Engineers would call a pre-feasibility study, which is that we are looking at all the assets given the data that we have, given the budget that we have. We don't have an enormous amount of budget, frankly, to do this. The Corps of Engineers would charge roughly 20 times what I would charge to do the same thing. Well, they do it a little bit better. So keep that in mind as well. This is basically identifying the big picture items, although I think we've actually developed techniques where we can get fairly specific in terms of what we do. So we identify assets at risk, and the main risks here are coastal erosion. Of course, if the property disappears, anything on that property disappears as well, and you may need to abandon some property before erosion actually hits the structure. We've already seen that happen in Pacifica before. And also flooding is a big issue, obviously. Flooding from 100-year storms or other major storms, and we do have techniques to evaluate flooding costs. So we're going to value these assets in dollars. Now, not everything can be valued that easily in dollars, and one of course the downsides or limitations of any benefit cost analysis is it's easier to value some things in dollars than it is other things. Now, I know many of you are concerned about residential property and commercial property. The good news is those are relatively easy to evaluate in dollar terms because we do have fairly good data, which I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes. The engineering costs cost of any adaptation strategy, but also the cost of any infrastructure, electric, water, et cetera, that has to be removed or that would be removed. That's all going to be estimated by ESA. So if you have any questions about that, they're standing ready to answer those questions. So for private property, which makes up probably the bulk of the property at risk in the city of Pacifica, we start with the parcel data. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I'm pretty sure everybody in here is familiar with property taxes because most of us who are homeowners, including me, pay property taxes. Well, we have that property tax data that goes to the County of San Mateo, and with the modern GIS, Geographic Information Systems software, we can identify exactly in a spatial sense where that property is, and then we can overlay on top of that the erosion maps and the flood maps. So we can tell whether one specific parcel, and that parcel might have a house, it might have a shopping center, it might have a church. We can identify that property at risk. Now, if it is a taxable property, in other words, private property, residential property, commercial property, we can look at the assessed value and we can update that. Of course, as you probably all know, the assessed value of your property is not necessarily the same as the market value. But we have a technique to do that. Basically, we use something called a housing price index, which looks at the inflation rate in housing, and we look at when the last sale was, and we can calculate what the value of a specific property is. Now, I should note right away that this analysis is not designed to identify what the value of each individual parcel is. We're aggregating. So my argument would be that if we're looking at 100 properties, we can get a pretty accurate estimate of what those 100 properties are worth. If you look at one specific property, it might be off. So keep that in mind as well. For flooding, we also look at something called the depth damage curves, which have been developed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Basically, if your house has 1 foot of flooding, we can estimate what the percentage loss will be based on the size of the house and the value of the house. And again, that's not as precise as I would like, but it's the standard technique that's used pretty much everywhere for these types of analyses. For commercial property, we're going to use the best available data. I'm hoping to talk to some people in the city of Pacifica who can give me more detailed information than I have now. Obviously, there's some very valuable commercial property, hotels, shopping centers, etc., in the city. And so, I'm looking forward to talking to anybody who has more specifics on what that property is worth. I can also update the parcel data there, but I would rather, since there's relatively small number of properties, I'd rather actually look at and talk to individuals in the city of Pacifica. A couple of people in the comments asked about sales taxes, transient occupancy taxes. I'm going to do the best that I can. I can get the total sales tax data, the total transient occupancy tax data for the city. But the question is, say for example, at Rockaway Beach, you lose a hotel. I don't think that's likely, by the way, but suppose that happened. I can't give you the transient occupancy taxes for the Best Western Hotel because it's aggregated and it's illegal for me to even ask that. Although if they wanted to tell me that wouldn't be illegal. So I'm going to do the best job I can with sales taxes and transient occupancy taxes. You can lose transient occupancy taxes not only if hotels are damaged, but if the beach erodes and you have fewer visitors come to Pacifica because of beach erosion. That can also affect transient occupancy taxes and sales taxes. That's a really big issue in some communities in Southern California. It's probably less of an issue for Pacifica, but still somewhat of an issue. For public property, we do something very similar. We look at the land for various public property and we value it using recent sales prices, transaction prices. Now, one downside here is that the government property is worth less than residential property just because the market value is less. And you could argue that's an artifact of zoning. But again, that is the way that it's done. So we look at the market value, the best estimate of the market value for government property. We look at the structures and we try to value those structures at replacement cost. We have reasonable data on the size of the structures, the type of construction, and so we just go in and look at an engineering cost analysis of what it would cost to replace that structure. Again, this is not meant to be a full feasibility study. So if I estimate this structure cost $100,000 to rebuild, that's an estimate based on a limited budget, so keep that in mind. The next thing we do is something called non-market value. I don't have enough time to get into that tonight, but there's a more detailed discussion in your memo, particularly in the appendix to your memo. But economists have spent many, many years figuring out how to value recreation where you don't have to pay. And the best example for that are beaches. So if you go to the beach in Pacifica or anywhere else, you don't have to pay to go to the beach, although you might have to pay to park. Well, we have standard metrics which tell us how much a day at the beach is worth. By the way, the Coastal Commission has said it's worth $40 a day to go to the beach. Most of those studies are based on Southern California beaches, but they want us to apply that number for everywhere. We can use non-market values for hiking. There are a lot of valuable coastal trails in Pacifica. And for golfing, we can use both market and non-market value. We have pretty good data since the golf course is owned by the city of San Francisco, as I'm sure many of you know. They have detailed records on how many people go, how much they pay, and we can use that data as well. You could argue, though, and I probably would argue, that the non-market value of the golf course is a little bit higher because people are paying fairly, relatively low fees to go golfing. But there are standard metrics that you use for the golf course, for hiking, and for beaches. The infrastructure, as I said before, is going to be valued by ESA, and basically they're going to look at replacement cost. If you have to reroute something, that also will be taken into account in their analysis, I believe. And it's also going to include maintenance. So for seawall, for example, you don't just build it and leave it. It does need to be maintained over time. So for adaptation, what are we doing here? Beaches provide recreation. They also provide storm protection. So the wider the beach, typically, the more storm protection benefits you get. Beaches also provide a lot of ecological services. We're not going to be valuing those in dollar terms. There are going to be the analysis will talk about the ecological value of these beaches, but it's very, very difficult to put a dollar value on that. That's something I've been trying to do actually for quite some time, but it's still a controversial area. So we're not going to be putting dollar values on the ecological value of these beaches. That doesn't mean that it isn't valuable, though. And again, a community value could very well be we want to protect these beaches or we want to protect these ecosystems. And so I want you all to keep that in mind. Armoring provides primarily storm protection. So the main economic benefit of armoring is going to be that your house, won't disappear or won't be flooded, or it's less likely to be flooded. The downside of armoring is it tends to lead to more beach erosion. It reduces beach recreation and ecosystem services, or it can. And of course, retreat preserves the natural coastline, but you have a lot of loss of inland property. So you don't tend to see retreat in areas where there's a lot of valuable property. So how do we look at the benefits versus the cost? I don't do benefit cost ratios. I don't like them. I look at something called net benefits, which is just benefits minus cost. Okay, so you look at the reduced public and private property loss. So if there's flooding, if there's erosion, we can value what that property is worth, what the damages will be. We can look at changes in beach recreation. If the beach narrows, you're going to have a diminishment of beach recreation, and we can add that all up. For the cost of adaptation, again, we look at the construction costs. We'll also look at any potential removal costs, if that's part of the analysis. If you have to demolish or remove property, that also would be considered in this type of analysis. And we look at infrastructure replacement costs. Now, Tina and everybody else wanted me to go through an example here. I don't know, how much time do I have? A few minutes?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. I didn't really want to go through this example because this is where I get in the hot seat. This is totally hypothetical. Please look at that word hypothetical. I'm just trying to walk you through what this is going to look like. The other thing I should say is This is going to be for a number of different planning areas, as you know, and it's also going to be for different timelines, typically 2030, 2060, 2100. You know, we don't really know what's happening in 2100, to be honest, so that's more of a guessing game. But we have a reasonable idea of what's going to happen between now and 2030. So let's say this is between now and 2030. We start off with a baseline. This is basically if you maintain the status quo. So if you're talking about Beach Boulevard, that would be that you already have armoring. If you're talking about Pacifica State Beach, Lindemar, that would be that you have, you know, a reasonably wide beach, okay? So whatever the status quo is, we start with that, and we look at how sea level rise and coastal erosion will impact what's happening right now. So for beach recreation, if we say you're losing $300,000 worth of beach recreation, that means that you are going to be losing recreational value over time if you don't do anything. If you just maintain the status quo, the beach will erode and you'll lose recreation. Similarly, for public land and structures, we have $1 million loss due to erosion, $500 flood damage loss. For private land, for public land, for private land, $2 million, $1 million, and infrastructure, $500,000. Again, those are all made up numbers. That's what professors do. But the idea here is you add all that up, and what this is saying is if you do nothing, you're going to lose $5.3 million worth of property, okay? Which is not something anybody wants. I shouldn't say property, value, because the beach recreation is not property. It's a what we call a non-market value. But you're going to lose $5.3 million worth of value. Now, if you armor, or if you increase armoring, in some cases, in this case, you would have an additional loss of $300,000 of beach recreation. So the beach is going to narrow further if you armor the beach. So beach armoring generally lowers beach recreation value if it leads to erosion. On the other hand, if you armor, you gain in terms of loss of public land. So instead of losing $1 million, you only lose $100,000. So the net benefit is $900,000. So some people call this avoided cost or avoided loss. So you saved $900,000 because that value of property will not be lost due to erosion. This is public land. For private land, again, hypothetically, you would save $300,000 over the baseline. For public land and flood damages, for private land due to erosion, 1.8, et cetera, et cetera. So you add all that up, but also you have to add the cost of the strategy, which I have down as $2 million, which is probably optimistic actually, but I mean it fits into these numbers. So when you add all this up, the net benefits in this case would be $1.7 million. So basically it's saying you would be better off doing the armoring than not doing the armoring. But this doesn't take into account ecological benefits. You might decide as a community that you don't want to do it anyway.
Excuse me, I'm confused. The baseline, you're not saying that the baseline, the status quo stays the same. You're saying we're losing something now under the baseline case, and so there's a loss of everything.
Right, under the baseline you're losing. Under the baseline you will be losing property due to a coastal storm, for example.
Historical precedent.
Yeah, exactly. So you add all this up, but this is basically saying, well, armoring, even when you take into account the cost of armoring, it's still beneficial. Now you can look at nourishment instead, and in nourishment you get more beach recreation, $200,000 worth of beach recreation. So that means in nourishment you've actually enhanced the beach, you've widened the beach, and therefore you get more recreational value. You also get benefits to public land structures, from erosion, damages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these are a little bit lower than armoring, which is what you'd expect. Because armoring typically does a better job of protecting private property. On the other hand, you lose the beach, part of the beach. The cost of the strategy, though, again, is a little bit lower. When you add this up, Nourishment comes out to a net benefit of 1.55 million versus armoring 1.7 million. I would say at that point, it's up to the community. That's close enough that this really comes down to the community deciding what they want to do. And again, this is completely hypothetical. I have no idea how the answers are going to come out. I mean, the more valuable the property, the more likely it is that some sort of shoreline protection is going to pencil out, obviously. So I hope that sheds some light on what I'm going to do. And this is going to be done for lots of different planning areas over different time horizons. Now, there are limits to this. I've already mentioned that, but let me mention it again. Our knowledge of geophysical changes is very limited. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. You know, Yogi Berra said it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And it's certainly true when it comes to climate change, because the view of what climate change will, how serious climate change will be, how serious sea level rise will be, that seems to be changing almost every month. Typically it's getting worse in terms of the projections. So we're making guesses, we're making educated guesses, but it's based on the best available science. So we're using the best available science, which is approved by the state of California, not by me. Now, market value may not be representative of true value. I mean, my biggest criticism of this analysis would be public land generally gets valued at a lot lower rate than private land, even if it's basically the same land with the same level of amenities. So I think that's a serious flaw in the analysis, but that's the way it's done. I'm not making this up, I'm doing it using standard analysis. Now, relative cost can change over time. We're assuming costs in 2018 dollars, but the cost of construction could go up faster than inflation, or the cost of certain types of construction could go up faster than inflation. We're not taking that into account. One of the comments actually that I got, a very thoughtful comment, was on that. But I can talk about that a little bit later during discussion, but we're assuming everything is in 2018 dollars. And as I've said several times, ecosystem services are very hard to value. This schematic that I have here is a standard one you would see in any environmental economics textbook. And really, we're only looking at a small part of the total economic value of a lot of ecosystems. So we're probably, I would say, definitely undervaluing ecological value for Pacifica's beaches and coastal areas. So that's something that all of you should keep in mind. I think I'm done.
One quick question, going back to that other slide you showed that on the right, the nourishment community, specifically on that word nourishment meaning what?
Adding sand to the beach, I'm sorry. Okay. So nourishment would mean adding sand. Already have it, I think.
Yeah, can we go to that next slide, the final slide, please, Phil? One more. Okay, so we didn't say this earlier on in the meeting, but this is all captured in a memo that is at the front table. And so the city is accepting comments on the memo until May 17th. So if after the meeting you want to take a closer look at that memo and you have other thoughts you want to share, you can send them to that email address. As Tina mentioned earlier, there will be a community work group meeting coming on the 31st where we'll discuss draft adaptation strategy, and then there'll be another public meeting on the 23rd of June, kind of like this, where it'll be a similar topic. So there will be more opportunities to get information and ask questions, but today we want to make sure if you have questions about the economic analysis methodology, that we have Dr. King here today to answer your questions. So I saw some people grabbing some of these forms. Would anyone who would like to ask a question like a form? We can bring it to you. Would anyone like one?
I just want to ask, is the Thursday and the Saturday, are those meetings largely duplicative then?
The content's going to be similar, the format's going to be different. So the format of the first one is really a work group meeting, so the community work group members with the public that can observe, and the public meeting is kind of like this. So it's a little bit of a different format.
And there are no more technical workshops. I mean, in the beginning we had a technical.
Microphone, please.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. So I believe there will be a technical work group meeting. That's less for the public though. So the best place to get sort of access to information is in those meetings. Okay. Has anyone filled out a comment form who would like to have a question answered or would like to make a comment? Okay. So just raise your hand if you have, and we'll come around and collect them. Okay, find out. Okay, so Peter Guzman Garcia has a question. What's the total value of the residential and commercial public lands or total assets in the city of Pacifica? Is there a total number?
I don't know what, there probably is, but I don't know it. We're only looking at the hazard zone, so I don't know what the total value is.
Okay, does that help?
Kinda, yeah. I mean, my understanding was that based on the methodology that you were using, you could spit out a number.
We could, but that's not what we're tasked to do. But we'll be looking at the hazard area, basically all of the property that is subject to erosion or coastal flooding. We won't be looking at property that's not subject to
Got it,
flood
okay.
erosion.
And
So,
then-
but there is a total value for the
whole city.
the properties at risk. That's possible.
There will be, yeah. I don't know what it is right now, but I will know in a couple of months or a month or so.
Okay, got it.
Those are properties inside that red line?
Well, there are lots of different red lines, yes, but yeah, within whatever, there are different hazard zones depending on, what the sea level rise scenario is, what the time frame is, but we'll look at all the property within whatever the red line or yellow line is, yes.
Okay. So you need a card, Richard? Okay. So Peter had another question. What's the total cost of the different adaptation strategies suggested in the April 20th memo? So what are the cost of the strategies?
Is that coming later or?
So I think that maybe the confusion here is that we are still doing that analysis. So we wanted to share the methodology with the community because there's been a lot of questions about exactly how this is going to be done. So some of the conclusions are not available yet.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So Ron Mako?
Yes.
Ron, would like to make a public comment?
Yeah. In comment, I just have discussed a little bit about issues I discussed earlier before the meeting with another Rockwood Beach resident. It has to do with, we have some memorial benches in front of the Moonraker restaurant and the Lighthouse Hotel. There's 3 of them there. And several months ago, one of them was pushed by the way over topping and pushed it against the parking lot wall there and damaged it, knocked part of the wall out and damaged the bench. And actually, there's 3 benches there. I just want to bring this to the attention that in this situation, I think that maybe the benches need to be moved. And I'm also aware of the fact that I think Half Moon Bay has changed their memorial bench program down there, especially along the coastal trail in Half Moon Bay. So it's something we need to think about right away. We've already had some damages done there at Rockaway, so I just wanted to bring that to the city's attention.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Ron. Jim Kramer?
Hi, I've been worried for some time that the total value of the beachlands as public trust properties for the whole state of California are being undervalued. I don't think they're represented by the same local stakeholders, and I don't think they get as much attention because they're so difficult to place a value on. You mentioned that you're planning to use the CCC's estimate of $40 a day times attendance as an estimate for the non-market value of things like the beach. Does the CCC put that number forward as a plausible estimate of the total value of this public trust property, or is it just partial? Because usually travel cost stuff is just a part of the total value.
It's just the recreational value, and that's a very good point. And I've actually worked with the Coastal Commission quite a bit on this issue and have an article coming out actually in a few months on that exact issue. So there is the recreational value of beaches, which is how many people go, and Lindemar Beach is reasonably high recreational value. There is also the storm damage value of beaches. Beaches are a buffer against storm damage to private and public property. And we are going to be estimating that simply because that's included in ESA's analysis. If you have a wider beach, you have less storm damage. But there are a lot of other ecological values we're not estimating. And we will have a discussion of that. I have in my appendix to my methodology, I have a pretty long discussion of the non-market value of beaches. And I think that's something that the state of California needs to do a better job on.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to that though, because, okay, so you're
Hold
saying.
on, let me get you a microphone just so people can hear you.
So this estimate is called the willingness to pay, so WTP or whatever, it's the $40 for the beaches or what have you. But I guess actually a big factor that we're not putting in there is actually what people spend in tax dollars to come down here, because every economic study that we've done in Pacifica has shown that the only way we actually will become a sustainable city, economic-wise, is that we get more tourist dollars in. So on top of just saying, yeah, well, I'd be willing to pay $40 to go to the beach, on top of that, what we're actually losing is the fact that if people don't come to the beach, then they're also not gonna spend money on things like restaurant, bars, and those things. And I don't see that being factored in at all in this.
I've done that type of work in a lot of other cities. We don't really have the data. I can use data from other towns in California, but most of them are in Southern California, so I'm a little bit reluctant to compare Pacifica to say Carpinteria or somewhere else. So I can give you a really crude estimate of what they might be, but I can't give anything that I would want to say is reasonably accurate. So I think you're right, that's an important issue. That's something that a lot of business people in particular are interested in, but I don't want to give you a number unless I have reasonable data to back it up.
Right, but putting a zero value on it is not close to accurate at all either.
Well, I would be happy putting a range in it. That's something that we haven't really discussed yet. We could say, it's between $10 and $50 million or something. I would be happy with that. I think that's something that we still have not figured out. That's not part of a formal benefit cost analysis, but the scope of work does say we will try to estimate sales taxes and transient occupancy taxes that are impacted by these changes to the best of our ability. Now, the more data I can get from local people, the better off I will be, frankly. So I'm hoping actually to get more data on that. But to really figure out how much people spend when they go to the beach, typically you'd use survey data. And I'm reluctant to use survey data from Southern California beaches. But that's how I would have to do it.
Okay, I see a couple follow-up questions, but we do have some cards in the queue. So let me just get to these and then we'll get to you. Just give us cards. So there's a question from Tony Saskell. Will they be rebuilding the north end of the seawall on Beach Boulevard, which is just a retaining wall right now?
So that is one of the city's CIP projects, but we don't have funding for that at this point. So I would say that it's an intention.
Okay. The next question is from Lindsay. Does the benefit cost calculation include the cost of frequency of updating infrastructure in the cost of the strategy? Is that right?
So in the calculation that you were showing for the cost benefit effectiveness, was the cost of the strategy, did that include like updating the infrastructure on that, or the frequency of having to do these? Yeah, like maintenance.
It includes maintenance, so.
Yes, the engineering solutions will have a component of maintenance that factors in, time, the frequency of updating a rock revetment, for example, or maintaining or rebuilding a seawall, and the timing of that.
Okay, so and a question from Cindy Abbott. This is a related question to what Lindsay just asked. How does the net benefit calculation incorporate ongoing needs, i.e. more than one time between nourishment, repairs, maintenance of seawalls, etc.?
Yeah, well, it will include the cost of repair a seawall. If nourishment is an option, typically you have to re-nourish every 5, 10, 15 years, and ESA will provide that. Bob probably knows more than I do.
That's a really good question. We have a couple of choices. One thing that we often do is select a beach width that we feel provides certain outputs in terms of protecting the backshore and providing recreation.
And then when we model the effect of sea level rise, we look to see when that width is reached and when it looks like it'll get narrower, and then we essentially add sand at that point at a fixed amount. And so what happens in sea level rise is you add sand more frequently as the sea level rise accelerates. There's other ways we can do it by looking at greater amounts of sand placement at fixed intervals. But I think the former is the typical way. So that's a discussion that we could have, how we should look at the redirection.
Is that done by directors?
Yes. Typically.
So Jim Steele has a question. Who pays for the nourishment? Is the state accountable for the loss of sediment? Sure. Yeah.
You know, one issue I don't see being discussed, they'll say, we want to keep our beaches as well as protect our property. And often we'll say a revetment will cause the beach to passively erode. But part of that equation is how much sediment is brought to the beaches versus how much is fluxed out. And all the USGS studies show for the last 100 years that because of dredging in the bay, because of mining in the bay, because of all the dams that are put up, we've been progressively losing sediments, which means that these other agencies have been costing our beaches the nourishment that would happen naturally. And so they should be paying some of the costs for us to nourish, because some of the erosion is happening because of this denial of sediments that we should have. And also you can see just the way sediments flow. North Ocean Beach, even though it's had a revetment since 1929, that beach has widened, even though sea level has risen by 8 inches. And there's a number of studies through the last 10,000 years, even when sea level has risen 10 times what it is doing now, that some beaches form because you get more sediment. And a lot of times you lose sediments due to a storm from something like El Nino. But at the same time, the El Nino storm brings more sediments back to the beach. And so if that natural process is disrupted, then we could have beach erosion that's going to happen whether it's sea level rise or not. But you know, the sediments, any nourishment that we do to protect our beaches seems like other agencies should pay other than the city.
I think you have a good argument there.
Where do we send that bill?
Okay, the next question is from Amy Kaplan. When will the city make a final plan? How long will it take for the Coastal Commission to approve or deny it? Will decisions come to a citizen vote, or if not, how will financial commitments be decided or rejected?
So there is a schedule in the slides. It's also on the website. Amy, there you are. So the city is going to have a draft adaptation plan out to the community for comments this summer. And then we'll have comments back, revise and respond to those comments, and then to our decision makers in the fall. And then once the city council approves a plan, it goes to the Coastal Commission. And I can't speak for the Coastal Commission's length of time that they will take to review that. And then I think that the last part of your question was about funding alternatives.
Once we vote on it,
So the plan itself, the adaptation plan and the local coastal plan update is not something that the voters would be voting on. If there is any funding mechanism in the future that is decided to go out to the people, that certainly that would require input from the community with a vote.
So this is your question. So in addition to the economic analysis, the triple bottom line approach inform the alternative selection for the plan. Make sure I get this right. Are there plans to discuss the environmental and social criteria or considerations? So assuming the criteria will be weighted and represent community values and priorities, so that would need input. Is that right, Steve?
Yeah, and it's kind of an overarching question of, we're looking at the economic analysis today, and
the professor's point about in the alternatives where it's somewhat of a wash or the economic value is not very distinct, I think those will then more rely on non-monetary criteria, which is the social and the environmental, and generally those are weighted, and that will then, cause the priority, where those alternatives land in terms of the overall cost-benefit weight. So that's typically where, it represents more of the community priorities as well. So just thinking of, is there a place in this process to weigh in on that before we see how the alternatives pan out overall?
I think that's an excellent point. And I think Bob maybe was gonna say something, but I think that we need to discuss with our consultants on how to flush that out.
That's a really important point because ultimately the community values is essentially kind of a weighting process. And then you have property value or fixed infrastructure. You also have other resources like ecology or access, aesthetics. So I think that is the process we're in. We're going to provide a look at different adaptation scenarios, and we are going to output beach width as an indicator of access as well as ecology. But the community will have to weigh in on whether or not the certain outcomes that may protect property are enough, or whether there's a desire to also spend more money to do other things such as have a beach. And that it's not an equation that we've worked out yet because we can't really value the natural environment and some of these non-market things effectively. But that is what everyone should be thinking about, I think. How much money would we be willing to spend to do more than the minimum, let's say, of protecting property? I don't know if that helps. Yeah, it's the public workshop process is where people weigh in like you just did.
Okay, the next question is from Jeffrey Bruno. How will the erosion of beaches be estimated? Will there be a team of marine geologists or something else? So there's two questions. We'll start with that one. So how will the erosion of beaches be estimated?
So we've worked on a number of these studies forecasting beach erosion with both looking at the historic trends as well as the effects of sea level rise. And so we have a lot of experience doing that. We've done it for Pacifica for past projects, but we'll be using a model that considers the historic erosion rate, current conditions, the current beach width, and considering the different sea level rise scenarios, using standard practice for forecasting the shifting of the shoreline due to sea level rise, and with the do nothing approach or armoring, in the absence of anything else, we'll have a certain forecast of the beach erosion and shrinking. It can be used to play out different beach nourishment alternatives, so we can add width to the beach under the scenarios of beach nourishment, for example, and play that out in time. But it's essentially a methodology that uses a historic erosion rate given the available data that we have from past shorelines to show that historic rate, and then using some equations to relate sea level rise to an additional shore response. Is that sufficient of an answer?
Right over there. Yeah, it helps. I mean, I like that gentleman's comment about the flow of sand through the bay. I was surprised to learn from my daughter's geology class at San Francisco State that most of the sand on our beaches here come from the Sierra Mountains, that it actually flows all the way down from the mountains. So there must be a vast reserve of sand from Ocean Beach that flows this way that keeps replenishing the shoreline as well. And I don't know how one would estimate that without a lot of data underwater and in the bay and all those different factors. So that's what I was partly trying to get at, is trying to understand how would you estimate something of such magnitude.
Yeah, we'd have another study, I think, would be short answer with a lot of funding to do that type of data gathering. But ESA has worked on a regional sediment management plan in the past, which does dig into that a little bit. But with the limitations of our study, we're using the best available data that we have and the best science practice. If Bob would like to add it on to that.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. I don't know if you want to get into the physical process.
Let's give you a microphone.
So I actually am published on this topic, and I've worked on a couple of projects with the Army Corps of Engineers and others in the state on how much sand moves around Ocean Beach and in and out of the gate. And, it's similar to what the USGS has come out with, which they've done a lot of recent studies. The best estimate I've seen was done a while ago, and it looks like something less than 100,000 cubic yards a year, probably closer to 40,000 cubic yards a year, migrates south from Ocean Beach to Pacifica. And where that sand goes, we don't really know. It seems to be going offshore, and it's lost for some reason. The provenance of the sand is the Sierra Nevada mountains and some local sources, but that's really more of a geological time scale. There's some question about whether or not the hydraulic mining in the mid-1800s contributed a lot of sand to our beaches, and of course that pulse of sand is no longer active. And but there's also indication that because of sea level rise, the waters in San Francisco Bay are too deep to really maintain a very large flux of sand from the Marquesas Strait all the way through the bay and out to the ocean. So there's another school of thought that our sand budget is pretty fixed, and it's mostly moving around Ocean Beach, and we get a little bit from there. So the bottom line is we have a sediment deficit. Our beaches are narrower than they were historically, and our backshores are eroding because the waves are not dissipated adequately by the beaches. So I think that adding sand is one alternative we can look at, and getting someone else to pay for it or help us do it is something that is possible because of our federal and state programs. And San Diego's been very effective at getting outside money to help them. So that helps.
Jeffrey, your other question is, will estimates be made for the various adaptation strategies and projected sea level rise levels? So do you mean the cost estimates?
I think for the different adaptation strategies, if we're going to, one of the ideas is to keep a certain margin of beach. I was just wondering how that would be estimated, related to the cost of maintaining that and what's expected.
Yeah, so for a quick example of the beach nourishment strategy, we would look at the existing conditions. Let's say we currently have a 50-foot beach, and that's what's optimal for the purposes of recreation and storm damage reduction for the backshore. So under a beach nourishment strategy, it could look like, hey, on the first year, we start by adding another 50 feet of beach by placing the required amount of sand given the geometry of the beach. We then forecast the erosion rates considering the historic rates in the area and the sea level rise amount, and track that beach width. And as it narrows because of erosion and sea level rise and gets to 50 feet or whatever that trigger would be determined, that would instigate the next beach nourishment. And that, I think that's a good way to just forecast out what do we need to do. It's not getting into the, do we have enough money to add the second or third beach nourishment, but what is required given this standard strategy. How many times do we need to nourish the beach and when? So yeah, we would be modeling that for those scenarios, and also for scenarios in which we don't have beach nourishment. If we're just looking at armoring the backshore, we would be able to tell when the beach would be gone, and that also affects how much we would have to maintain and or rebuild the armoring structure, whatever it may be.
Okay, next, Talitha Darrington, comment?
Thank you. Untitled Chapter, and I just wanted to alert you to a methodology called surfonomics that was created by the Save the Waves Coalition. That might be something to add to your strategy. When you lose a beach, you change the wave, you might even lose the wave. They did a 2015 analysis for Mavericks, which is not Lindemar, but it was $24 million annually, $57 a day in consumer surplus. Excuse me. And I would imagine that Lindemar possibly has more because it's more accessible place for people to surf. You don't have 60-foot waves. So I just wanted to alert that, bring that to your attention. And I did have a question. When I'm wondering if the economic analyses, and maybe this has already been addressed and I missed it, but I'm wondering about future costs because there's a future cost for armoring the beach. If you lose the beach, then what do you have to do in the future? Same thing with if you nourish the beach. So I'm wondering if there's any foresight or forecasting for future costs in your work, or if that's a plan and you're not done yet. I know you're not done yet, but that's my question.
What did you call that strategy?
Surfonomics. So it's surfer nerds that are economists.
I think it's one of my former students who did that, Ryan Vaughn, actually.
So I'll address the future costs, and yes, we will be determining what the future costs may be under different strategies. Armoring alone, renewing the armor will have to take place more regularly if we don't have any beach in front of that armor. And so the cost would go up either by increasing the extent of armoring, or creating a larger structure at the next time that you need to maintain it, and that would cost more, or assuming a maintenance cost that increases in frequency in order to achieve that same erosion and storm damage protection. Similarly, a beach nourishment strategy coupled with armoring would reduce the requirements for maintaining that armor, because there would be a beach to help reduce the wave impacts on that structure, and that would also be reflected accordingly in our estimates of a particular strategy like that.
I did another local coastal program for Ventura County where we actually separated out surfing, and surfing generally does have a higher value according to economic studies, and I think Ryan, one of my former students, did that study actually, which I was very proud of. We don't really have enough data, and Lindemar is not Mavericks, but that is certainly something that could be done. I don't think it's going to be done in this particular instance, but I think it's worth mentioning that Pacifica is becoming more of a surf spot today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So I think we should definitely put that in the report.
Okay, Richard Harris has a few questions. I'll read the first one here. Where does the Coastal Commission require you to use the $40 a day recreational value for beach days?
Can you run that by me again?
Yes. Where does the Coastal Commission require you to use the $40 a day recreational value for beach days?
Well, it's based on a number of studies of beach recreation, most of them in Southern California, but not all of them. And there was a report, there was a NOAA report that was put together a couple of years ago for the Coastal Commission. I was part of that. And essentially we looked at a group of studies and decided that $40 was a reasonable estimate. And I testified about a year ago to the Coastal Commission in Solana Beach. They were not happy about me, but I basically testified to the Coastal Commission that that was a reasonable value. I don't know how much you want to get into the weeds on that, but the Coastal Commission would really like a fairly straightforward method to figure out how much a beach day is worth. Before, we were trying to do different studies for every single community, and we just don't have the budget to do it. And we also decided it was, and in some ways, more equitable to have a sort of a standard number across the state. So, that's sort of the short answer for why the Coastal Commission decided to do that.
Well, that's the specific. Do you have a site to? Is it an order from the commission? Is it an opinion? Did it come out of that Solana Beach case? Because Solana Beach is a very different place than these beaches here, different weather, different topography, different surf conditions, all of the above. No danger, can't swim here signs at Swan Beach. So I'm asking, one, what's your site? What's
Well,
your
there's a citation in the method. The memo has the citation.
I read it, I didn't see the citation.
Pretty sure it's in there. I'll go back and look at it again. But
Well, then I'll get it from you afterwards.
Okay.
You say it's in the memo that you gave us?
Yes, I believe.
There's a footnote there, but there's no citation.
Okay. Well, I think you guys can talk about it.
Yeah, we can talk about it.
Okay. The second part of the question was, does it not take, you might have a different value for a sunny beach as opposed to a rainy beach. Or you might have a different value as to a beach that is safe for A, swimming, B, surfing, as opposed to a beach that is not safe for either. Is the value the same according, are you saying that it's the same value?
Well, the Coastal Commission has decided that it should be the same.
And that's in the citation that you're going to give me?
Yeah, if it's not in there, I will give it to you, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so Richard, you have another question here, and maybe you could read it for me.
Yes. No, that was the second, that was that discussion. I had a second question.
Let me get it for you.
I'm seconding.
Okay.
Okay, this is a question from Richard. Where are you aggregating the values of
Why
the-
are you aggregating?
Sorry, thank you. Why are you aggregating the values of the residential properties rather than adding individual property values? So why do the aggregating?
Well, we are adding them all up. That's what I mean by aggregating. We're adding them all up, and that's the aggregate.
So you're taking then the shapes that you have, you're identifying each property that's in those shapes, and then you're placing a value on each one of those properties and adding them up?
Correct.
Okay. And that has to do with the residential properties?
Yes, for residential and for all properties.
And-
Then we have parcel data for.
Okay. And then will you have an accounting for that so that you say property A on street, on street B, and the number of that, and then a value? Will that be in your backup data?
I mean, we're doing that. This analysis is not meant to say that your property is worth, $500,000 or $800,000. So that's what we're doing in Excel. But we typically don't release that data. But it's how
But you
it's
could.
done, I suppose.
As backup, okay. And then the question was, where will you be getting those values? Will you be getting the values from a market valuing company such as Zillow, and I know that there are others, or will you be using some other method?
Well, we use the assessed value, and let me go back. We go back to the last transaction date. This is getting into the weeds a bit. So, if you buy a house, if the last time it was sold was 10 years ago, Proposition 13 limits the increase in assessed value to 2% a year. So if the value of the property has gone up by more than that 2%, we can go back and look at a housing price index. And yes, it does include Zillow. We've run Zillow numbers and other places against expensive commercial databases, and it actually works pretty well for changes in values. I'm not saying Zillow is going to tell you exactly what your house is worth, but the change in the Zillow values is a pretty good indicator of the change in housing values. So that's what we're doing. So we're looking at the inflation rate for housing in the city of Pacifica, over the past how many years.
Okay.
So you have one other question.
No, I think you answered it. Thanks. Thank you.
Sam Casillas has a question. Why is the city allowing new construction in places where we know sea level rise will affect at this time. Why isn't a moratorium being considered?
Well, moratoriums are very difficult. I can say that new construction projects that we have that are in the hazard zone, we do ask them to do a hazard analysis. Part of a regular use permit or findings for entitlements is to make a finding that the health and safety, public health safety is protected. So we are doing that analysis, but there is no moratorium on growth.
So next is a comment from Giacondi Egan. Do you want to just make the comment, or would you like me to read it? Okay. So Giaconda's comment is, okay, as a Beach Boulevard resident, I gladly forego, I think, some of my ocean views to save my property. The promenade needs to be constructed into a real seawall high enough to accommodate sea level rise and raised high enough at Clarendon Road to at least match the height of the golf course levee. The current level of the promenade at Clarendon Road needs a much higher walkway, not just a sand berm.
I've been living in my house since 2004, so that's what, 14 years? I get hit by the storms. I used to be just water, so you put the sand back and you're okay. Now I understand why I'm getting sand. You answered that question today. 2016, 17, and 18, the sand came into my garage, not just the water. I had sand all over my pipes inside the house. Had to hire someone from outside to clean all the sand in my water pipes. 2017, somebody said that there was some damage on the 2 benches on Rockaway. I had a little swimming pool in my backyard. My backyard, I live right on the corner of San Jose and Beach. So my backyard is on San Jose. The power of the waves and the sand went into my backyard. I had no idea that I had damage in the backyard. I was so worried about the front until my next door neighbor came and started screaming at me. What happened is my swimming pool was totally damaged. I don't know how it happened, but all this, the blocks came off and they knocked all over landscape. It went to her. That's the power of what we're talking about. The wind, the storm, and not the sand. And you guys didn't help me pay for that. You didn't help me pay 2016, 2017, 2018 for damages. I went to the city and asked to do a little wall because you guys are not protecting me, so I have to protect myself. And I was asked for $3,000 just to get the process started for a permit. I already have incurred for the damages. And I'm sorry, I work for the government, I'm retired for the government, I have a high-level job. And when I came to these meetings, and before the meeting, I was prepared to give straight answers. We're not getting straight answers here, and it's very frustrating.
So I believe that one of the adaptation strategies we're going to look at is to improve that seawall at Beach Boulevard. I'm pretty sure that's, I think we said that, but I was expecting that's what we were going to do unless somebody objects. That's one of the alternatives. I think the question of what that looks like and whether or not the people that live at Beach Boulevard would be willing to have a higher wall that might obstruct their view, I think that's something I've been wondering about. And I think one idea that we've had, and I think the city may have talked to the Corps of Engineers about, is putting in some sort of recurve type structure so that the wave run-up is kind of deflected back. It works somewhat, it doesn't work completely, because it still can go over the top. But I think that's really good input, that you would be willing to have a higher wall. And the other idea is perhaps to also build a second wall or something that might have to encroach onto the roadway, but might together act like a taller wall. it's something we're gonna look at, but it's gonna be hard to solve. So I, appreciate your understanding of that as well. We'll look at it, and I don't know that we'll be able to predict exactly in this study how well it will work.
Okay, the next question is from Spencer Potter. Does the economic analysis factor in the cost of mitigating the potential loss of endangered species habitat and fresh water to brackish wetlands in the Moray Point, thanks, Spencer, and Sharp Park areas?
The short answer is no. That's one of those things that we don't really have a way to evaluate in terms of dollar values. Now, if there's data that I don't know about, it is possible to value some ecosystems, but it's really difficult to do. That doesn't mean it's not important though, and that should go into the report. And I would be the first person to say that should be part of the community's decision making. And by the way, the Corps of Engineers often will say, if this is a habitat restoration project, we don't necessarily have all of the techniques to do traditional benefit cost analysis. So all those things matter, and all those things should be in the report, but that's not something that I can put into a benefit cost analysis unless I have a specific technique. I've done some work on non-market valuation for beach ecology, but it's not ready for prime time.
There has been analysis work done on analyzing the cost of wetlands and endangered species ecosystems, and I can provide that to you.
That would be great.
Okay, a comment from Celeste Langiel.
Thanks. I support the comment about including analysis for endangered species habitat, and also support the Surfonomics analysis being included. I'm not that familiar with the economic analysis, but I was just wondering, how do you deal with the one-time costs, like the loss of the property, versus recurring costs with recreation, where it's a daily cost for a certain period of time, such as the loss of the TOT tax or sales tax? So how does that work with the timing of how the economic analysis and assumptions you make about timing?
That's a very good question. We do deal with that. I didn't want to get too far into that in my discussion, but we do look at it over time. And so as you're saying, if there's a one-time loss for property, $1 million, whatever, then that's a one-time loss. For beach recreation, every year you get beach recreation. In fact, it tends to go up over time, obviously, because you get population increases. So we take into account the fact that you get recreational benefits every year. That's what we would call a flow in economics, whereas the property is a one-time loss. That is taken into account.
Okay, and I have a second quick question. So I understand this process is sort of, tiered to what is going to happen on the ground. Like if A happens, then we're going to take this action and that. Do you have anything like that with funding? I mean, with if we don't get the funding for this, then what are our other options? Because there's going to be a huge number of cities and entities looking for funding for these same projects.
So we are going to be looking at multiple allocation options for each of our planning areas, and not just a single one. I don't know if James wanted to add anything to that.
Okay, so the next question is from Peter Guzman.
I'm going to follow up on that really quick.
Oh, sorry, James.
That's all right. So one of the options that we're proposing for adaptation as an adaptation alternative for each of the areas is to proceed under the sort of the existing approach, which is to armor after emergency events happen. And that, I think, is close to a sort of a what if we don't have the funding to build a 200-foot wide beach with sand retention structures and the full works. So as part of the alternatives analysis, one of the alternatives that we're proposing to include will be one of the, like a Plan B approach. And I think that that's as best as we can do, aside from assuming everything erodes, which I don't think is going to happen because we won't let it. So there will be sort of a Plan B alternative that is considered. that could be considered as a, economic backup plan.
Okay, thanks, James. The next question is from Peter Guzman Garcia. Peter, I might know if I can see the numbers right.
Well, yeah, so, sure. So, on the memo that, for May 4th, the study that you guys, I think, published, or this memo that.
Is it the economic analysis?
Yeah, that memo. It says that, the cost of a seawall is, it looks like $97 million per mile. And then it talks about, and then it says offshore reef, 76 million per mile. Is that correct, or it seems kind of a lot?
Yes, that is correct. They are expensive. It's based on engineering estimates that have been worked up for past studies, and some of those values I had run by the city engineering department. Van Campo revised a couple of those numbers for me that are more accurate in his opinion. So, yes.
How can an offshore reef be cheaper than a seawall?
An offshore, so a seawall is there to be a hard barrier against erosion. I think an offshore reef has more ability to change a little bit. It doesn't have to be built so that it doesn't move at all. But a seawall is, in that memo, the cost of a seawall is looking at, are you familiar with the Ocean Beach seawall? It's just the heavier construction.
Okay.
Much more extensive, reinforced concrete and larger, as compared to what an offshore reef is assumed kind of like a long pile of rocks, to put it simply.
Got it, thank you.
Michelle, have you asked your question?
I don't know where to start. I have a question specific to Shoreview Avenue residents. 13 homes, first line of defense for the city's infrastructure, rip-rap seawall that we all paid for since 1982-83. Required to maintain it at our own expense. My question is, and the question I think there's a lot of insecurity because Shoreview's not being addressed. A lot of Beach Boulevard conversation, a lot of Lindemar conversation, nothing for Shoreview. And is the repair and maintenance of that seawall going to be transferred to this program when you're talking about $96 million and all this stuff for how many miles? Is Shoreview included in that, or are we required forever to be responsible for our own riprap? And I could go on about all the stuff we learned about riprap versus solid structures for days, because I'm the longest tenant, the longest homeowner, former homeowner on that street from 1982, and have been through 3 El Niños and various seawalls. So that's what I think everybody on that street is really concerned about, that property. We are one of the last remaining stretch of homes that are directly on the ocean. There's a few in Lindemar, and there's the, I forgot the name of it already, down in, well, also in Lindemar that are right on, but they're in that code, shelter code. So Esplanade is gone, and everything north is gone, and we're the last ones. And so what happens laterally determines whether we exist or not in the future. And those homes have sold and have upgraded, and they're viable properties. They're over $1 million homes now, again. And there's no mention being made of it. And that riprap is on a 40-foot slope. It's been there since 82, 83. It has been consistently maintained by all of the homeowners, regardless of who they are. You know, they came and went. And all the new people have done a really good job of and being very conscientious about about maintaining it. But there comes a point at which, if everything around us is being funded, then we should too.
So I think Bob wants to chime in, but I can maybe try to address that. So there's quite a bit of Pacifica shoreline that's armored. There's areas that are private property that's armored, and then there's areas where the armoring is protecting public infrastructure or lands that now are belong to the city, and perhaps there's some trail amenities such as on Esplanade. So historically, public funds, the city funds have not been allocated to armor private property.
Yes,
And
that's wrong.
That's
In this scenario,
there's
that is
opinions
wrong.
about whether or not that's wrong or not.
Well,
And that is something that can be a part of the conversation here. I'm not saying it's been decided.
That's all I'm saying, it needs to be.
Carlos, yes,
Yes, first of all, for the homeowners in Shoreview,
hold on.
for the homeowners in Shoreview, I just want to say that Tina, very generously, and Bonnie are going to be meeting with us to discuss this, and I hold her to this. But also, I don't know how we can make the city and you guys understand. Yeah, you talk about private funding or government funding for public areas. We cannot sustain Shoreview forever and ever. How can I say this? We are the first line of defense for the city. You are not considering us. You are not counting us in your projects. We cannot sustain the seawall forever. It's becoming more and more expensive. If one of the homeowners cannot sustain the seawall, the whole seawall goes. And you can say, well, too bad, that's the homeowners. It's not just the homeowners. It's the street, it's the utilities, it's the sewage, it's the electricity. It's your problem. And it's the problem of the neighbors across the street. So when you are considering all this, and you're not considering Shoreview, you are doing the city of Pacifica a big disservice. Because we are just holding it temporarily. And when you come with those numbers of amazing amounts of numbers to hold a seawall, how do you expect us? I'm a social worker. I had to get a line of credit from my house to pay for the seawall last year. How many lines of credit do you think I can hold before I can't? And then who's gonna pay for that? You guys are gonna have to pay for it. Because when my house goes, you're gonna be responsible for the utilities in the city. You're gonna be responsible for the sewage, for the lines of electricity, for everything there. So when you're considering this and you don't consider Shoreview, and I really appreciate that. And by the way, who here is from Shoreview? Please stand up. And I have to say, there are 26 neighbors waiting for yours and Bonnie's final email so we can meet. It's happening. It has to happen. Because, really, if you don't consider Shoreview and you say, we're going to fix the whole city, but not Shoreview, it's just a problem for you waiting to happen.
Okay. Do you want to add to that, Bob?
Well, I'd like to respond, if you don't mind, and I'm not responding, but, so, we will be, CVU is included. Shoreview, I'm sorry. Yes. I live here, I do know where it is, even though that didn't sound like it, but, yeah, it is included. We are going to look at, an alternative with armoring, in your neighborhood. It is included. And we're also going to look at sand placement. And what we're trying to figure out are what some of the other alternatives might be, or what the hybrid might be. Now, the reality is that some of the funding is not available for the public, like a city, municipality, to protect private property. Some funding does not allow that. It doesn't, that public money is not available as for private property as much as it is for public property. That's just the way it is.
Well, I'm sorry, I was just to say, landscape's the way it is, that needs to change.
Yeah, no, I'm not, yeah, I hear what you're saying, I'm just saying we can't change that, so.
Outmoded concept,
Yeah.
because it is, the public property is also private property. I mean, Beach Boulevard has a promenade. Okay, that's public. But everything behind that is private. And to protect, you're actually protecting them. You know, the promenade, okay, there was not a promenade when I first moved here, and we walked, you know, down the beach and had a wonderful time. And then, you know, but the houses behind that are the things that are being, really, that's the value that's being protected. That's the monetary value. A promenade is an asset for amusement and exercise and community, but the value are those homes that are selling for $1.5 million now. I mean, so you can't differentiate between public and private anymore in this situation, in my mind. That's my opinion.
The next question is from Brian O'Flynn. Once the plan is voted on by the City Council and accepted by the Coastal Commission, if the public decides it wants a different plan, can the plan be changed? And what's the mechanism by which this would happen?
If a city decides that they want to amend their LCP yet again, I believe they can do that. They need to go through the similar process and submit it to the Coastal Commission for approval.
Okay, next question is from Timothy Cowan. San Pedro Creek drains across Lindemar Beach. Is there any study regarding the effects of sea level rise and backup during high winter runoff on western Lindemar neighborhoods?
Yes. We looked at the existing FEMA map, which shows a significant portion of the West Lindemar neighborhood within the 100-year floodplain, and we augmented that floodplain considering the different sea level rise scenarios that we'll be looking at. So while the West Lindemar neighborhood is not technically in the city's coastal zone, we at ESA identified it as still vulnerable due precisely to that fluvial source and the effects that sea level rise will have on it, and so it is included in the analysis.
So, would you read the rest of that?
Yeah. So, I think the comment from Timothy is that nourishment cannot raise the beach above San Pedro Creek flow levels without likely flooding consequences.
So in other words, if you, I can probably do without the microphone. So and I realize this was addressed to some degree in the West Lindemar section, but and this is not obviously a pressing issue, but it just has occurred to me over the years, especially if we talk about nourishment, by observing Lindemar Beach through the seasons, is while the high surf is in the north end, it seems like it's the southern part that gets exposed more in the winter, and you have the stone and other things being, as the sand is taken away. So I've just been wondering that, if you're nourished 99% of the beach, but you have to leave the creek outfall at the level that it is, every time you have a huge storm, as we do coming off of Montero Mountain, it's all the runoff from that, and you couple that with maybe a king tide, it seems like somewhere in the future, at least Lindemar Shopping Center and the lower end of Lindemar, certainly the rehab center on San Pedro Terrace Road and those sort of things, maybe sooner than later, they'll be affected by that type of thing. It's just the question of it, the idea of bringing in nourishment just seems like such an enormously challenging solution to that issue.
I'll respond to that comment. A part of the adaptation alternatives proposed for specifically the West Lindemar neighborhood, we have proposed things like a small flood wall along the creek, along that shopping center to address that issue. So it can be included in our analysis, while not directly related to, whether the beach gets nourished or not, that hazard can still be addressed in the adaptation plan.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is from Len Balbus. Len is not here. Okay, we'll ask this question anyway. The discussion's been about the reality of beach erosion. Has anyone thought of building a structure to protect the beach? There is the issue of the cost of stopping the erosion mechanically. So,
a part of the adaptation alternatives that we've proposed, that we've kind of outlined some preliminary, at least in our thinking, the sort of incremental steps of adaptation. First would be to simply armor the back shore. That would provide erosion protection and the required maintenance to maintain, to keep that protection through time. And that would be to add beach sand, nourish the beach to both provide some storm damage protection and some recreation. Also limit, slightly reduce the amount of maintenance that you would need on that structure. One step further would to be add sand retention structures, either through an offshore reef that could help limit the amount of wave energy transporting sand, or a concept that Bob has thought of utilizing what we're calling artificial headlands, functioning similar to Maury Point. How, if anyone's been down there to Maury Point, the beach is pretty wide there in front of the golf course, and that's because the headland provides a limit to the sand transport and allows the beach to persist there. So as super A+ plan to provide as much beach retention as we can would include something like that, a series of artificial headlands up along the northern part of Pacifica to function similarly to the existing Maury Point, and so as to maintain the beaches longer and help make those beach nourishments last longer.
Thank you, James. The next question is from Julie Lancel. Julie?
Yeah.
Hi, Julie. Would the existing seawall around the pier be maintained? It has been nearly covered by sand over the 30+ years of its existence, or is there a different alternative?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. Would the existing seawall around the pier be maintained?
Yeah, it was when I first moved here, it was very low. I mean, there were stairs that took you down to the beach. And now it's up, and now it was, you took steps to go down to the beach, and those steps are now long gone, covered by sand. And I'm just wondering, and I think you've actually kind of talked about this a little bit already, but the sand is quite a bit higher than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, so a seawall solution for that area would include the base of the pier. I don't think we're proposing any actions on the pier specifically, but a seawall solution for that area would include the length that spans.
Well, I think there is a seawall there, in the work. But it's just filled up with sand. Yeah, we do have a seawall there. It's just over time, this level of sand has risen probably about 15 feet from where it was initially. That's all. That's my recollection. People could correct me; they would work better than I do.
The sand is always on in front of my house. Come see it. So there's no wall because of the sand.
Well, yeah, the wall is. It used to be the sand used to be much further. Sorry, I'm just repeating myself. The sand used to be much further down. When you walked along the seawall and looked down, it was further down. That's all I'm saying. I'm just curious about that as an activity, and if there's any solution of activity of sand.
Okay. The next question is from Craig Joyner. Will soil stabilization using grout or other methods stabilize beaches in slow erosion?
I think it potentially could, but that's not something we're considering in our alternatives. I think that would end up adversely impacting the enjoyability of the beach for people and animals that like to burrow into the sand, but I'm no expert on that.
Okay, next question is from Alan Grinberg. Is the economic analysis going to include other technologies such as artificial reefs, jetties, etc.?
So some of our alternatives, tiering into the more expensive category, to put it simply, do include or can include something like an artificial reef, or like I just mentioned, the artificial headlands that serve to maintain beaches longer and also provide some recreational opportunities like surfing and fishing.
So the next comment, so I'll invite you to read it. I believe is it Robin Renell, sorry. Question. Okay, I will read it. As a homeowner in Shark Park, I support a higher seawall from Clarendon Road to Paloma Boulevard. Shark Park Beach is currently full of sand with no loss from the levee or promenade. Please explain this process from the groin structure existing. What is this word? Sorry. Oh, existing we know as Mooring Point. Many in this audience were here last time. We're not here last time.
Bob, would you like to take this one?
Sure. Do we have the slide from last time that showed the, yeah. Well, so what we showed last time was a schematic where we had these kind of conceptual structures like jetties that stuck out from the shore and had a broader end piece that would be like a function like a headland, like Mooring Point. The idea being that if you go look at that beach and walk the levee, you can see that the shore is a little bit wider when you get south at Mooring Point than it is up by the pier. And the shore kind of takes an angle so that if you stood with the shore parallel, you'd be facing a little more north when you're just down at Mooring Point. The idea being that the big headland interferes with the waves moving the sand to the south. And so the sand kind of accumulates and it rotates into the waves so that the average wave vector or wave approach is kind of straight on. That's a real simplification, but the idea is if we somehow mimic that natural headland with some artificial structures spaced north of that location, like maybe one at Clarendon, one up at Paloma or something like that, and continued up north, we could create these little cells that would be like the beach at Mooring Point, and it would be a little wider and rotated to the north. So that the idea would be, it's a coastal engineering approach that you see on the East Coast and other places where the waves are smaller in the Mediterranean Sea and stuff like that. There's a lot of concerns with those types of things, but it's one way to try to protect the existing shore, the back shore with all the homes, and also have a beach. So it's one idea that we've come up with.
Would that in any way, those types of structures benefit the beach off of the bluffs, such as Shoreview, or possibly helping to restore the area and deepen the beach?
Oh yes, thanks for that question. Absolutely. So if we put one of these structures at Paloma, which is the one there in Palmetto and Beach Boulevard, the widest part of the beach would be up in front of that neighborhood, and then it would narrow into, then considering the expected geometry, you would put another one in, so that you build these little beach pockets. So yeah, it would widen the beach in front of Shoreview and reduce the, did I say that one again? Is it Seaview?
Sure, that's right.
All right. So it would widen the beach and reduce the size and the duration and intensity of waves getting their rocks. So they would their cost would be reduced. Or with sea level rise, the cost might be the same because the waves may get larger as the ocean gets higher, the runoff will be a little bit higher. But anyway, way, if you look at it, it would help the neighborhood and help the residents. That would be the intent of the idea.
Thank you.
Comment from Stu Lauderwas? I'll just.
I know what I said. This is a financial analysis, and I just looked up a property that says on Zillow that it's worth $1,225,000. It's sold this week for $1,600,000. That's a huge percentage of difference in what Zillow says. And if you're taking the initial assessed value, I don't know what your multiplier is, but I'd be interested to see what the multiplier is for that. And if you lose a house, someone suggested that if you lose a house, that's not a continued loss. It's totally a continued loss because you don't have the property taxes anymore if you take away a property.
Well, I mentioned a little bit earlier, if you look at Zillow for one property, you can certainly find there's an error. But we're just looking at the increase in the average based on Zillow values over time. So we're saying if the houses go up, according to Zillow, by 10%, say between last year and this year, we're going to increase the value by 10%. So we're looking at that in the aggregate, not just at one house. Now, is Zillow perfect? No, but it actually works better than you think when you look at it in the aggregate. No, the property tax, you're right, that is a continuous flow of taxes that goes into the city. That's correct.
Okay, the next comment is from Tom Thompson. Tom, here. Do you want to just provide it? Or I'll provide it. So Tom would like to echo the comments of the lady with the property at Beach Boulevard and San Jose Avenue. My property is across the street from her backyard. We need improvements along Beach Boulevard to provide an effective seawall. Will the sea level rise study address this obvious need? If so, when? And if not, why not?
I think that's maybe similar to an earlier question. So yes, it will. And it's actually rebuilding a portion of that seawall is already in the city's plans if we can get funding in the future. But yes, that entire area is in the city.
So will there be any methodology or recommendations for how to finance these sorts of protections like bonds or special assessment districts or something like that?
So I imagine that the study will say that the city will need to look into that, but that's not the intent of the study, is to figure out the best or the method of payment at this time. That'll be a future analysis.
You mentioned a portion. Is that the north end is the retaining wall versus the south end, which is more of an actual seawall?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Next question is from Siavash Moizami. Can ESA share the sources for the unit cost estimates for infrastructure replacement? Where and when did this data come from?
Yes, we can provide that, and we will. The data came from recent studies as well as input from the utility managers. I've got cost replacement information for Comcast utilities, typical cost of replacement from the North Coast Water District. Let's get that one wrong. They provided cost information directly from the horse's mouth. The information from some of the armoring strategies were revised by the Director of Public Works, Anna Campo. I think that's all the stuff I can rattle off the top of my head. Other more specific sources for particular solutions will be cited in the adaptation plan.
Okay, the next question is from Lindsay Bales. How will we fairly distribute strategies along the coast of Pacifica? Will only parts with the highest economic value be prioritized?
So I think that's a great point, and it's something that when we develop the policy, we will need to determine whether or not the plan at this point is to create a prioritization. And there's probably a variety of ways to do that.
Okay, the next question is from Penny Keating. Does your plan allow for an option to raise our houses on the beach in the future if need be?
The adaptation strategy of raising the houses is, I think, in the mix. And the policies specifically haven't been drafted at this point.
Okay, there's a comment from Amy Kaplan. Amy? Okay. Sure.
I'm sorry to keep jumping in, but it's really helpful for us to hear these ideas that you have, because it helps us understand what we should include in the adaptation strategy. So raising homes is what the Coastal Commission's guidance we call accommodation, and that is one of the adaptation strategies that we can include. It'd be interesting to know if the people of the box would be amenable or interested in us including that as one of the elements of the adaptation strategy. We do have some unit costs for that kind of activity. So where's Penny? Oh, there also, sorry. Is that something people in that area would be willing to do, do you think? You've already thought about it? Yeah. Yeah, it's logical because then you can stay in the same place and just move up. Yeah.
I was just going to comment on the idea of raising the homes, is that the underlying geology there is very unstable. So to actually put a home on poles, you'd have to dig those poles down to bedrock. It might become quite impractical and expensive.
Okay, a comment from Amy Kaplan. Just want to remind everyone that with increased heat, we'll have stronger storms, and roads and homes in the landslide zone are also at greater risk. Pacifica needs to remember that sea level rise is only one of numerous accelerating risks. Brian Flynn has a law question. There's Brian. Is Brian, you back there? I'll let you read. Using my voice.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for everybody for coming out. It's great to see the public participation. So one question I had for the consultant was if there was an option of retrofitting the revetment seawall along Beach Boulevard north of the pier by drilling piers immediately behind the existing seawall and connecting these concrete reinforced piers to a concrete curtain wall, which is then to anchor to the revetment blocks via epoxy embedment reinforcing steel. The combined curtain wall / revetment would be one structure in the end, and it's probably a very cost-effective method of converting the existing revetment to an actual bona fide seawall. Second question was related to the valuation. The property valuation methodology seems flawed for arriving at a more accurate valuation, especially for properties which have not been sold for years, and the current property tax basis grossly underestimates current market value, which will not be corrected by using recent annual increases of property values. Choosing a suggestion, choosing a sample neighborhood or sample block in each neighborhood to do a detailed property by property valuation with current market value would be a cost-effective check on the accuracy of the gross estimates. And if need be, then the gross estimates can be adjusted upwards or downwards by the difference in the inaccuracy.
So, Bob, did you want to address the first comment, and did you receive the second one?
So I am a licensed civil engineer. I'm not an expert in structures and seawall construction. I've done a few of those, but I think the question is whether or not you could build a reinforced concrete structure on top of the rocks at Beach Boulevard and extend it, is that correct?
No, drilling piers down to bedrock, behind the seawall, right adjacent to it, so you're saving all the shoring.
Yes.
Then you go ahead and take out sections and connect with the curtain wall that is tied between the piers and then anchored to the existing revetment blocks or the gravity blocks. So actually, in effect, make them part of the seawall.
Yeah, so that would be a soldier pile and lagging, or it's not really lagging, a panel wall. And that's certainly one structural scheme that you could employ. And you could use grout to temporarily at least use the rocks as a water control element. And there's a lot of grout out there anyway. Yeah, I think that's one structural scheme that could be looked at. We have some unit costs for seawall design, and we are focused mostly on gravity type structures and not the soil nail structures that are being used on the north coast. So our costs, unit costs, are a little higher. And so I just want to mention that because there are a range of costs for different structures. But what we've seen is some of these soft bluffs that the soil nail or tieback shotcrete walls don't last very long. Certainly if they don't have embedment. So anyway, we could talk a lot about structures. I think what you're talking about is more akin to the type of structural costs that we're looking at. It might be a little bit less expensive than our unit costs. So it's a good idea, I think.
Do you want to address the second comment?
I will address the second comment. Our methodology, if a house was, the last transaction was say 1980, our methodology, my methodology, looks at what the inflation is in housing prices between 1980 and 2018. So it should give reasonably accurate estimate of the house price. Now, the farther back you go, the wider the error band is going to be, I would agree. But it should be reasonably accurate.
And doing a test for certain blocks within that area, wouldn't that be a good check on your overall estimate?
If we have the time and the budget, that would be a good check, yes. I'm not
Or
sure.
even one or two, to see the accuracy of the overall estimate.
That's a possibility, yes.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next comment. Cindy Abbott, I'll just read it, has just... Sure.
And actually, since the conversation, I've come up with an additional question. And so first I wanted to ask about when you're coming up with solutions, will there be a narrative that talks about how a recommendation in one location may impact something further down the coastline? For example, there's been conversations here about building headlands, and it's my understanding that putting up a jetty or some sort of structure may benefit what's right in front of it, but impact what is further down the coast. So is that a narrative or some form that will be spoken about?
Yes, we would include a general description of the anticipated trajectory of each outcome, and particularly for that headlands concept, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. And then my original comment was that I have a concern about the undervaluing of the environment and the habitat, access to public beaches that benefit a very broad community versus individual property. And I am a Shark Park resident impacted by individual property. And you talked about how the impact of decisions like that, you can't put a value on that. And yet it will come down to a conversation of community values. So how are those community values determined? I know that City Council did some language about what's important in the project, but are there additional mechanisms, or how do we really validate all of that in the long run of personal property versus long-term habitat and the impact on future generations? How does that get into the equation? Thanks.
great point, Cindy. I think that, as Bob pointed out earlier, this type of forum is how we start to hear from the community and what is valuable, or what the community values. And I think that robust community engagement and hearing from folks on the draft plan and what they think about it, because it is going to explain in greater detail the trade-offs that will be apparent depending on what adaptation strategies are ultimately selected.
So it's public comment is going to be the driver versus some other process.
Yes.
Can I make a follow-up?
Sure.
So my name is Spencer Potter. I work for the Natural Resources Division at the San Francisco Recreation and Parks Department. And I just want to follow up on this habitat comment. As I mentioned earlier, there does seem to be a way to value endangered species habitat. And this is done through the process of compensatory mitigation, where you actually buy land that would form substitute habitat. And has been economic analysis that's been done on how much that stuff costs, like per acre for wetland, and also for substitute endangered species habitat. We at the Record Park Department are the stewards of the habitat for two very important endangered species. And the Moray Point with Shark Park habitat has been identified by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as one of the only 6 places, one of the 6 most important sort of last places for the San Francisco Garter Snake is present. So just want to go on record saying that there is a way to value this economically. It's a question of whether it's going to be done in this report.
So, yeah, I agree. I mean, that's correct. There are ways to estimate the values, especially for wetlands, which is because we have a known net loss policy for wetlands, and people are required to mitigate, and so we have done that. We know how much it costs. For beaches, it's a little harder because there isn't a no net loss policy for beaches. And anyway, so I have worked on a number of studies where we've estimated the value of wetlands and beaches, in fact, and other habitat, and so it's built. What we found is that it does affect the result. So if you put a dollar value on the ecological assets and put that into your benefit costs or your cost analysis, it does make a difference. The problem that we found is that we get a lot of criticism because there are a lot of people that feel that the difference is not real. And then they really criticize the estimates that we have used, the unit cost we use for the wetlands or whatever. So the Coastal Commission in their grants to the communities to do these local coastal program updates has not required us to actually estimate the dollar value of natural assets because it's has turned out to not be effective, at least recently in some. We are going to discuss it, I believe, in our scope, and we will have beach outputs. We could put in a narrative that includes these costs, especially if the city of San Francisco wants to provide what they think are reasonable values, and then we have some credibility with using your values because you have the asset. That we could do that. We could talk about it. We aren't planning to do the economic analysis with these because there's a whole other set of calculations that we need to do as to whether or not what the response of that system might be, and we don't have the budget, so that's not our scope. We have done it before. We could do it, but that's something that perhaps the city could ask the state if they want to fund that. We could do it. But again, just recognize there are people that once they see the result, they may say, well, I don't trust your numbers because it doesn't make sense to me that a wetland would be that valuable for people. I don't know if you follow what I'm saying. Yeah. So, sorry to belabor that, but it's something we're trying to do, and especially for beaches, actually. Wetlands are more known, so maybe for wetlands we could add it there.
Just to follow up for a second, Bob and I have actually been shot down more than once for doing this, but I'd love to see those studies, and it definitely should be part of the discussion. And if you have actual numbers, I don't think we're scoped to put them in there, but we could say, well, if you include this, then it's going to change your results. So I'd love to see those studies. At least, I want to see everybody's information. When I do an analysis, I'd like to see all the data that's available, even if it doesn't get into the number crunching. It's still important to put in there and say, well, here's another study, or here's another way of looking at the same problem.
Okay, the next question from Jeffrey Bruno. Will earthquake considerations be included in construction standards for adaptation projects, including seawalls?
I think that detail would come into play when the actual planning of the seawall is going in real life. This is a planning level study, so we're not getting into that level of detail for the adaptation alternatives.
Okay, Gordon Tenora, looks like you have a few questions.
Yeah, I was waiting that as the comments went on. I had input prior to this session as constructive feedback that was solicited from the community work group. So I want to pose those, as I haven't heard the answers to all of these yet. One of them has to do with the construction inflation, particularly. That it is considerably, from what I've found, considerably higher than consumer inflation. Estimations 4 to 5 times as high on an annual basis. And so I wonder how those might be reflected as you consider the cost for doing things over time, how that's factored into your analysis.
I remember that comment. That's a good comment, and it's something that frankly I've struggled with over the years, because you're right, construction inflation has generally gone up quite a bit faster than the consumer price index. There is a rule in economics that says if something can't go up forever, it won't. I mean, you're projecting out to 2100, which we were required to do. If you look at some of the inflations, you come up with, pretty ridiculous inflation as well in some construction costs. And sometimes things are cheaper to produce, like flat screen TVs or something. So it's difficult, to be honest, and I think that's a very valid criticism. We're doing everything assuming 2018 dollars, but I think that's a legitimate concern.
Yeah, because we're planning not for 2018, we're planning for 2050, we're planning for 2100. That's the direction for the study. So
we don't know what the cost is going to be in 2050 or 2100.
that's true, but you could apply a factor of what you might do, and you're applying those inflationary factors out to 2050.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I've actually done this analysis just hypothetically, or actually in reality in some other studies, and it's very tricky when you get out to that far. Even if a couple of percent differences projected out to 2050 can give you much higher costs. So I agree, it's an issue.
So yeah, we need to solve the issue. I mean, one of the questions I have here is, as I've heard this, is what are the actions going to be taken? So there have been some good suggestions, a lot of good suggestions from people here about add this to the analysis, do that. For example, the sampling that might be done on the value of property. But I don't, is that something you're just going to take away, and eventually we might see what you've done in changing the analysis that you originally thought you were going to do?
There's a relatively limited budget to do this. I mean, I'd love to do all these things, but part of it is, given that we have all these planning areas and scenarios, there's probably not the budget to do all of the sampling. We might be able to do a little bit of the sampling. In terms of construction cost increases, I might be able to be persuaded that some construction costs will, if you have evidence that you can provide me, that they'll continue to increase between now and 2050. That's something I would consider.
Okay, so what I'm looking for is some type of commitment we'll receive for these various suggestions, some type of response, whether it's included in the analysis or not. And seriously, if we need to spend more money to get a better analysis, then that's money well spent, as went back to the council and asked for additional funding for additional meetings, et cetera, you might estimate what that additional analysis might cost and let us decide at a council level or not we can spend that money.
So to your question, I don't see how we're going to guarantee tonight that a comment or a question is going to be included into the study. I know that you submitted some of your questions in writing. We do intend to respond to comments, and so you'll either see, hey, this was a great suggestion or great question. It's addressed on page XYZ, or you'll see, duly noted. Here's why it's not included in the study.
Okay, yeah, I understand you can't make anything here tonight, but something in terms of follow-up, even, Tina, you suggesting even to the comments all that are heard tonight, you'll also be responding to those? And then
We would request that you put comments in writing, and there's the, what was the due date, Bonnie? The 17th? Yeah.
I just wanted to explore this a little more because it's an important point. And I'm standing next to Phil because I'm not an economist. I was kind of multitasking, writing some notes while you were talking. Would something like a sensitivity analysis where we vary a discount rate or a net escalation rate or something like that be a way to handle all of these uncertainties? And that would probably require more money, more funding, but I'm just wondering if that's, rather than looking at each element, like construction costs versus housing costs versus general inflation, just looking at the discount rate or the varying it from 0 to 5% or something like that.
Yeah, you could do a sensitivity analysis. Again, we're already pretty stretched in terms of the scope. There's already been a lot of mission creep, frankly. But that is something one could look at. Let's suppose instead of construction costs being the same as, or increasing the same as other costs, we see construction costs going up at a much higher rate as they have over the last 20 or 30 years. It's possible to do a sensitivity analysis. But there are 10, 20 other things we could also do a sensitivity analysis on, and we don't have the budget. So it might be possible if there's a real demand from the community to do one or two of those things that we can do that.
yeah, I just think it's wise to consider some of these things, and if indeed there is a cost to doing it, then let us know what those are. Another aspect of cost, replacement cost for property. Is anything like that in the value? Because as we know with homeowners policy, you have, in case of a fire, you have a replacement cost that they will pay for, but some policies say replacement cost plus code upgrades, which God knows what upgrades we might have in the codes as a result of this planning. So is that a factor at all in considered in?
I remember that question too. That was a good question. But I guess the short answer is no, unless it has to do with adaptation. Somebody asked earlier about elevating structures. So that would be included as an adaptation strategy. But no, that's not included.
Not as a factor in the costing.
No.
Okay. I also mentioned things other than just property values and cost for those people who are affected by any of these relocation or abandonment type of things that they lose. They have potential loss of their jobs, potential they have to relocate, there's a cost to relocate, things of that nature. So is there any disruption type of element in the cost estimates?
No, I mean, that's beyond the scope of the project. I mean, it's interesting to do, but we just don't have the budget to do that.
Okay, next one. It mentions engineering cost estimates. Could you define what engineering cost estimates are and what's included in that?
Engineering cost estimate is the cost to implement a solution for the design and construction of a engineering solution. So we look back at past studies or individual projects or revetment project. Those cost estimates can include contingencies for the active construction of that, the oversight and project management, kind of what we call soft costs. So
And so it's fully loaded through the construction of it. Does it include maintenance at all or some type of ongoing?
so the maintenance is kind of comes into play with how we scope out these alternatives. We have I think for a big revetment or a seawall, maintenance is kind of manifested in an ongoing replacement cost. So after 20 years, we expect that we're going to need to incur this cost again to either upgrade or reconstruct or otherwise further fortify the structure.
While you're there, I didn't see in one of the tables on the infrastructure costs things for gas or electrical lines. Is this just a matter you haven't received the data so far?
Yeah, PG&E holds all of that data, and it's very sensitive information, and they do not release it. So we did not have it for this study. I've been in touch with a lady at the county with a similar concern, and every community has to deal with this black box. So at this point, we haven't had any open lines with the PG&E. They haven't provided any of the spatial data for where their facilities are, which makes sense, but it's not included because it's of national security or other.
So what will happen if you don't receive that? What would you use as a proxy for determining those costs?
That is a good question. We don't, at this point, it's just a gap in the study. Like, we don't have the best valuations for everything. That includes PG&E and facilities.
But intend to fill it with something. You will identify that.
I don't know. I don't see them providing any information, and we can't make anything up without backing. So I'm not going to make something up for it. If you have a suggestion, I'd be open to hearing it.
I have no idea.
Neither do I.
Literally. But it at least has to be noted as absent.
Oh, it definitely is.
Okay, it is absent, but it's not noted as absent. Okay, there's also mention in the memorandum about capital costs, whether that be included or not. I can see definitively whether they're to be included or not.
Capital cost relating to
do anything, to do these costs, we'll take a bond measure, for example, will have capital costs, right? The cost to borrow that money. So it mentions this in the memorandum about capital costs, and that should be considered, but there's no elaboration there of that.
No, I was talking about the discount rate in that particular case. What discount rate you should choose when you're looking over time. And my argument was, if you're looking at, say, seawall, which obviously in the city of Pacifica is an issue, you want to look at the cost of financing a seawall, which would typically be at municipal bond rates. So that would be if we use that discount rate, it would be those capital costs would be factored into the analysis.
Okay. And then I guess the last one I have for now has to do with the valuation of the Sharp Park Golf Course. So I don't understand how you would use a revenue figure to determine the value of that course. That's just something that comes out that's set by a fee basis that has nothing to do with the value of the land itself. And shouldn't there be another type of valuation, like from a firm that understands the value of golf courses, the construction firm or something?
Well, as long as it's used as a golf course, it's valued as a golf course. And it could, as I just sort of...
That's not as its revenue. Its revenue does not reflect its value to the community, et cetera. That just says how much money we make from it. That's not its value.
Well, I was just going to say you can look at non-market value, and so you would argue that it's worth more than the $30 or whatever people pay per round of golf. But the way you would value it is as a flow of this non-market value. It's the same way you'd value a beach. So if a round of golf is worth $40 per round of golf, I'm not saying that's the value, but it's in that ballpark, then you'd look at the number of people who golf at Sharp Park, and that's a matter of public record from the city of San Francisco, and you would say it's worth this much per year, and it's a flow of those services, just like a beach.
Yeah, that gives you something annually if you were to lose partial of the use of the course, but that to me doesn't equate to that, so.
Okay, I've got one more question. I've got two more questions. The second to last question is, Siavash Moizami, has a new seawall that takes off the cap off the existing wall and built in front of it been explored?
Could you repeat it and I can try to.
Yeah, and is Siavash here? Okay. Let me ask this again, let me know if I got it right. So has a new seawall that takes the cap off the existing wall and builds it in front of it been explored? Do you want to?
So this is Tina. I'll let Bob answer the question, but I do want to say that these design questions are kind of not what this study is doing, but will be done when the actual wall is designed. So, but if Bob wants to answer the question just from an engineer's perspective, that's fine.
Yeah, what Tina said, but also, you're talking about the Sharp Park wall with north of the pier, or?
Yes.
Yeah, well, the problem there is to build something in front of the existing wall, there's all those rocks, and it's very difficult to build any kind of foundation through those rocks, so you have to remove the rocks, so, but then you can do something, I think, as an engineer, we're going to take kind of a higher level look and take a unit cost, and we could use a different unit cost in a particular area like that upgrade for that seawall rather than a cost for putting a new seawall. And I think your question is really helpful in helping us think about that. We haven't estimated that yet, and that is something that we need to do. Thank you.
A question from Ron Makel from here.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, this is something that I actually.
Yeah, hi. This has to do with Sharp Park, the golf course, and the flooding. This is actually kind of reiterating some comments I made much earlier on in this process. But you have two watersheds, two creeks that flow into the golf course. Brighton Creek watershed, and then you have the Salada Creek watershed, which is the third largest watershed in Pacifica, and that comes from, has its headwaters almost up at Sweeney Ridge, flows down through by the archery range and into the golf course now. But you know, a lot of water is coming out of these watersheds, and unfortunately, the wetland area there is choked. You know, it's very unhealthy. It's just totally overgrown with you know, wetlands, rushes and tules and stuff. And so the place gets flooded, and part of the big problem there is the water can't get out of that area fast enough. So I've often felt that. The question that I have really is, there have been any studies done on opening the berm where we have that big sump pump there? Because sometimes the outflow pipe on the other side of the berm is covered with 5 or 6 feet of sand, and the water can't get pumped out. The pump's about ready to burn up because it's trying to push water. But anyway, it's an idiotic system, and I just can't help but think that opening that up so that you have a natural flow of all of that water coming in there out to the ocean, and that might even, has there been any studies if that would even help the beach there at all, having a natural connection between that? And I also did want to point out, last year they dredged there, but it's called Horse Stable Pond. San Francisco dredged that out and removed, I don't know how many hundreds of yards of muck and silt and stuff out of that because it wasn't functioning, and then they dumped it over there back there on top of the old rifle range. But it's just an idea that you periodically have to do that every time because the silt can't get out of there. It just builds up, and then the city gets flooded down there in Sharp Park, up the lakeside in Florinda. So at any rate, my question is, has there been any studies at all into the idea of naturalizing the flow of that water into the ocean?
This is actually a question for Spencer.
Spencer Potter with the Rec and Park Department. So we're actually under order from the Coastal Commission themselves to regulate the pumping to a certain level. in the Laguna Salada wetland. We negotiated with them back and forth and came to, basically, they were telling us, you have to do this, under state law. And we're following those parameters to the letter. So unfortunately, we cannot change them absent going to the Coastal Commission and trying to ask for some sort of different agreement.
Good. Bob, did you want to ask this?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about something there just real quick, not about the golf course. But I think your question relates to flooding from runoff. And there are some impediments in drainage of that area on Clarendon and that road that cuts across, I forgot what it's called, that we all drive on. But so we do have an adaptation strategy in the write-up that includes a small levee by the Fairway Park neighborhood and around Clarendon where there are low areas, and also a detention basin, which we kind of already have as a pond at that intersection where the city pumps water out down Clarendon and over the. So one of our ideas would be to kind of formalize that and put another pump station over by Fairway Park, and then you can pump water to the ocean or to the golf course, Laguna Salada, either one. I'm not sure that we want to get into which one that would be, but the point would be the Fairway area and Clarendon area would be kind of independent of the golf course drainage impediments and the like.
One more question here.
Hi, I'm a relatively newer resident, so these have been very educational in terms of history and background. I'm curious, you mentioned that there's an existing capital improvement program that's adaptation themed, that's unfunded and not implemented yet. So I'm curious, are there other adaptation related plans that are unfunded and still need to be done? And if those will be somehow replaced by this plan or could be amended so there's a holistic plan for the city?
So the plan I mentioned, I apologize if it was confusing, is the capital improvement program for the city, and it's all capital improvements. It's not adaptation specific. It just happens to be that we're aware that this replacement of the seawall is something that we need to do, so it's in the program. There's other capital improvement programs or projects that may be coincidentally related to an adaptation, it's incorporated into the budget, so it's going to be available in these next couple months for the public to read, but it's not an adaptation specific capital improvement program.
Okay, I'm just gonna go back a slide of next steps. First of all, thank you all for coming tonight. A lot of good discussion. Hopefully some of your questions got answered. I know with you, it's certainly helpful for the city to get your feedback, and that will be considered moving forward. The next time, the next series of meetings, the first being on Thursday, the 31st, which will be a community worker meeting, and then a public meeting will be on June 23rd, is going to focus on the adaptation strategy or strategies as they relate to the coast. So there'll be more specific information about the strategies at those meetings. And I see some folks taking pictures of the screen here. This PowerPoint presentation will be on the project website, so it will be uploaded there and you can access it there if you'd like to see the information that's in the slides. So, good question?
The May 31st meeting is something anybody can attend, or it's private?
Yeah, it's open to the public and it will be here in this room. Yep. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. Have a good night.
Did I miss a footnote?